My name is Isaiah Lewis, and Shay Dewhurst Brown is behind the camera. We also have the executive producer, Chloe. Thanks for coming in and helping us out. So this is this week's Ask an Expert. So we have some questions for Dr. David Morrison-Love, or David as he said I can call him. So Dr. David Morrison-Love is a lecturer in technology education at the University of Glasgow School of Education. He graduated from the University of Glasgow in 2001 with first-class honors and received the TTA medal. He was awarded a PhD scholarship from the Underwood Trust, and he completed his postgraduate studies while teaching technology education at a secondary school in Falkirk. His thesis identified differences in school pupils' use of cognitive processes and forms of knowledge during technological problem solving. He began lecturing in 2012. Since then, he has taught across many technological disciplines as well as educational topics such as robotics, design, curriculum, and assessment. He has also participated in a wider initiative supporting and leading development of technology education, including being the program leader of the Bachelor of Technology Education degree program, leading the design of integrated master's program in design and technology education. He works with researchers from around the world, including England, New Zealand, and right here in Canada. His current area of research include investigating factors that support problem solving, success, and building an epistemological framework for technology activity. Dr. Morrison-Love has received multiple awards and recognitions over his career, a few of which include one in 2016, which he received the 21st Century Leadership Award from the International Technology and Engineering Educators Association, who also awarded him with the 21st Century Fellow of the ITEA just 1 year later in 2017. And finally, in 2019, he received the Sylvius Wolonsky Award for outstanding publication in the field of technology and engineering education from the Council on Technology and Engineering and the G. Harold Sylvius Foundation. So without further ado, we'll introduce Dr. David Morrison-Love, and thank you, Doctor, for coming in this week. Oh, the pleasures are all ours. If you're ready, we can go right on into the first question. Perfect. So in your chapter, you discuss the tangible ideation as a pedagogical approach. That approach becomes apparent in its application to design, manufacturing, and skilled trades content. But what would it look like in something dealing with software and digital technology, or something like the study of green industries, which falls under a facet of technology education? Oh, no, sorry, just getting that the audio is not coming through the screen on your side. Yeah, that's all right. Just give us 2 seconds, some technical difficulties.
Yeah, the audio's coming through for us, it's just not coming through on the stream, and it's not on the audio too.
All right, so I think we're back. Do you want to go try and give it a test there, David?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? I think I should do the testing, 1, 2 part.
We're just waiting. It's going to be like a 20-second feedback, so just give us a couple seconds.
No worries at all.
David, are you able to increase your mic volume? You're coming in a little quiet on our end.
No, we're good? Yeah, no. Everything's good. We're ready to. I'll take it from the top on the question if you're all good with that.
Okay, yes, that's fine.
All right, so let's try this again. In your chapter, you discuss the tangible ideation as a pedagogical approach. That approach becomes apparent in its application to design, manufacturing, and skilled trades content. But what would it look like in something dealing with software and digital technology, or something like the study of green industries, which falls under a facet of technology education focused on agriculture and urban design in Ontario school curriculum, where the effect of a manipulation isn't immediately seen?
So I think first and foremost, you ask very good questions. So they have made me think, um, which is brilliant. Um, and I think the tangible ideation idea, I suppose, has come about from a number of different experiences. So when I think back to when I taught in secondary school, um, there was always a sense in which pupils used sketching a lot to come up with ideas, and I maybe just did it because it was the done thing. And over time, I kind of became aware that there were sort of tendencies and pitfalls and challenges maybe around asking pupils to represent things in 3 dimensions, and to think about something that would ultimately, for them, be 3 dimensional, but to think it through in 2 dimensions. There was a lot going on there. So the idea behind it was one about reducing abstraction, originally, and as a pedagogical approach, it may or may not be something that you would want to use in other areas of the curriculum. So it very much locates itself in that design and ideation area of learning and teaching. Um, and I think maybe in the examples that you cite, there's a decision there about whether you would want to be using that type of pedagogical approach, and it would depend upon the context and it would depend upon your educational purposes at the time. But I think there's maybe two parts to it. One is about knowledge, and one is about this idea, I think, of reducing abstraction. Um, and the idea of the pupils and students being able to interact with materials gives them, I suppose, a form of knowledge that's difficult to get otherwise. Um, and those two elements are things I think that you could consider in the areas that you identify. Now, you talk in the question about the areas of software, the areas of digital technology, and actually I went and had a look at the agriculture and urban design sections of your own curriculum. And it's these are three very different areas. There are maybe some instances in which the the idea of tangible ideation could have a place in some of the design components around the agricultural part, and it would in a sense be you know designing and working through management solutions and things like that in situ with the materials, with you know sort of things. Now, I don't know the extent to which that's appropriate or not. Um, when it comes to things like software, there's a lot of, I think, in design and technology, it's often the case that we develop software, we develop coding, we use these sorts of things within a practical context. So often it will be in the service of controlling something. Um, there might also be times when we develop, software systems as a form of technology. So from a tangible ideation point of view, if we were looking at software, what I would probably do is I would want, as soon as is educationally appropriate, for pupils, students to start thinking through the coding element of it, to start thinking through the relationships that the code has with the physical things it's controlling, the materials as soon as I can. Now, I know, not my area, but I know that in computational thinking, there's a lot of evidence that supports the idea that all these dimensions of computational thinking are better taught out with that context. And that's just why I say as soon as possible. So really, at the end of the day, it could look very different in different parts of the curriculum. You may not want to use it in all areas of the curriculum, but the one consideration pedagogically might be this underlying idea of at what points can I reduce abstraction, because I think some of the most challenging, some of the big challenges pupils have in their learning is this ability to relate the practical to the conceptual, to the ideas, and we often assume that it's far, far easier for them to do than it really is. I don't know how much that answers your question.
No, that does excellently. And talking about computer thinking, I'm sure a lot of our viewers can reflect on some of the courses we did last summer and apply that to how we learned that course. So that's excellent. Thank you for that. If you're ready, we can go on to the second question.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Perfect. So in another part of your chapter, you stress the importance of guiding our pupils to consider the idea of extending or enhancing human capability in some way. When doing technology education, how can we better incorporate the idea of accessibility into our pedagogy and convey it in a way that our students can better value the concept of enhancing human capability?
So in this one, and this is in this question here, so the idea of extending or enhancing human capability, I suppose, came from some of these reflections about some of the philosophical discussions about our subject here, all of which are always really interesting, right? And, you know, one of the questions, if I think back to, again, when I was a teacher, you know, if I have a class of pupils who are designing, for example, a photo frame, there can be elements of design in that, there can be elements of craft in that, and I got to asking the question, is that technology, is designing a photo frame a kind of technological thing? Is a photo frame a technological artifact? Do pupils need to really be creating things that are perhaps technological artifacts? So a big part of what shaped my thinking as a teacher was the idea of extending and enhancing human capability in some ways. So in this context, I guess that idea was brought in as a way of helping to focus in on the idea that if, you know, pupils are creators of technology, what might they be engaging with? What might they be working towards? What type of thing would constitute technology for them? Because we have, for example, artifacts that are arguably quite technological in nature, but we have man-made, purposefully designed artifacts that are perhaps political or social in nature, things like passports, for example. So that's where that element came from in my own thinking. But in the question, I guess what you're talking about is this idea of perhaps making, how do we make our pedagogy accessible, or how do we make our pedagogy, or how do we enact pedagogy in a way that makes learning accessible and these types of ideas and thinking accessible to pupils? And I think it's quite difficult, and I've toiled with it over a number of years. Um, the idea of thinking about pedagogy in ways that are as authentically inclusive as they can be, so that pupils can engage with, the act of being a creator of technology and understanding technology through the creation of technology, is a really is it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity. The thing that lies in our favor, I guess, is that in design and technology, we have such a rich range, of content, of resources, of different types of environments, all of which lend themselves and provide, I suppose, fodder for us to think about how we can support pupils to access and engage in all of these things. The two difficult bits, I suppose, I don't have an answer, so I've not got there, in a sense. In my earlier days as a teacher, differentiation was a big, was a big thing, and it was something that I admittedly don't think I did very well. I thought it was very challenging, and it was quite a demanding and onerous thing that required quite a lot of knowledge of your pupils, to kind of plan beforehand pedagogy and content and the types of interactions, and opportunities that would account for, I don't even like using the phrase different levels of ability, because that's different all the time for all different types of concepts and ideas. So my most recent thinking, has shifted much more towards a sort of universal design for learning approach, which I which I suppose speaks to me at a very high level. So the principles of providing, lots of opportunities, different ways of engaging, and different ways of expressing, um, those sorts of learning processes, particularly in design and technology, I think, would be my way to go in terms of accessible pedagogy, that allows really all pupils to connect with that richness and that wonder of, you know, just as a thoroughly engaging subject area, but I'm hugely biased. So.
No, that's a fair answer. And again, another thing for us and our viewers to reflect on, as we just left a class that delves heavily into universal design of learning and stuff like that. So that's awesome that we get to link these two courses. But that's great. We'll change on over to question 3. In this chapter, you discussed doing in technology education as embodying craftsmanship. You discussed how developing this craftsmanship can instill pride and a sense of accomplishment in students, which can act as a positive feedback loop on motivation. How do you prevent or mitigate the possibility of the opposite from happening if you have a student whose skill level is significantly lower, particularly when you have physical products that can be seen by other students?
Again, another very good question. So, I stand by my assertion. I don't know. I think there is a distinctly human dimension to technology. I mean, I was in a lecture the other day with my IT students. We were actually looking at Aristotle, believe it or not. But the idea of techne, the idea of craft knowledge, and I don't know. I think the idea that you can get that sense of accomplishment, is not easily won. So I'm under no illusions. It's practical processes, fine motor skills in a public, and by public I mean classroom environment. It can be frustrating. The process itself can just be frustrating. I think back to when I was a teacher, and I had a practical classes. In Scotland, we have a small number of practical subjects that focus in quite heavily on wood or metal or electronic fabrication, and they don't lean very much into design at all. So it's very much about that craft knowledge. Um, and I had this one student, this one pupil, who had to take several long walks around the school to basically decompress because of the frustration around some of these practical processes. So it can get difficult because people can be their own worst critic. But as you say, you're in a classroom situation where different people, I mean, if we're being blunt about it, might have different levels of skill in different areas and things like that. The first thing I would have in my head is not to think about it in terms of pupils with different skill levels. And this sounds really, really counterintuitive. Um, a lot of it's to do with how, to my way of thinking anyway, how you as a teacher set out that whole environment. And I mean that in the most holistic sense of the word environment. I'm not necessarily talking about where we position tool cupboards and access to machines and all that sort of stuff, but there's a whole sort of shared endeavor around what's worthwhile in learning. And I would never be comparative, and I would never lean into any comparative notion in the classroom. What we would try and do is to recognize that it's a difficult process, it's a human process. I'd be very open and honest as well. So there were some practical processes I got really quite good at, and there were some that I remained really quite mediocre at. Whenever it came to glass cutting, I would get one of my far more capable colleagues in the department to come along and kind of do it for me or help me through it. And it doesn't always work and it doesn't always go right, but that's part of the whole process. So the emphasis for the pupils I worked with was very much not on the sort of skill levels per se, but almost on that process of developing and evolving and just building that sense and embracing the frustration. Frustration's fine, that's okay. And I think any real learning where you're kind of pushing yourself should kind of become uncomfortable. If you're in that situation where everything's a breeze and it's one would ask of the extent to which you're really learning things or you're enacting things that you're probably already quite capable of. So a lot of it's about environment, a lot of it's about how you set up that way of thinking with the pupils. Even when it came down to things like assessment. So in these particular courses, part of the assessment was based on tolerance, okay? Plus or minus a millimeter was it, which is quite a high bar if you are relatively novice when it comes to, woodwork, metalwork, and various things like that. But, we talk very much about the idea of getting, a level of sufficiency and accuracy. So still trying not to drive it too much by this external assessment, parameter that's set across the whole thing, whether plus or minus a millimeter has anything to do with its functional, efficacy or not. So I suppose it's really just trying to be authentic about it and being really reflective and a lot of focused pedagogy with particular students and pupils, because there would be parts of processes that they would be really quite good at, other parts of processes they needed to work at more, and really analysing and diagnosing with them collaboratively. What is it about the technique? What is it about the process that's maybe not, pulling through as strongly with us, and also getting them to predict a lot. So this is whole sort of idea of mechanistic prediction. It's not so much that you've not met a particular standard or you've not met the assessment requirements and things like that. I would like to hope, maybe a bit idealistically, if all of this worked well, that would kind of take care of itself. But what we could have to chat about is this idea that, well, if there isn't a bit of a wide, we're pushing tolerance a little bit here, what implications does that have for this part of the frame? What are the knock-on effects? And get them to try and, understand what the actual, ramifications of things like tolerance and all that are, and just getting a good sense of a collective classroom where we're all kind of in the same shared endeavour of pulling out of this process what's worthwhile for learning. They are not engineers, they are not craftsmen, they've not been contracted by someone to produce something to a particular, minute specification and so forth, and just sort of orient things around there so they bring from the process those things that are most valuable for them in terms of learning.
Excellent. And again, another extremely relevant answer to what we're currently learning. I know, again, last summer, all of that stuff is stuff we've experienced ourselves, the anxiety, the frustration. I've definitely had to go for a walk trying to build a shelf. But no, that's awesome. So David, we got time for one more of our scripted questions, and then we're going to go into the audience, if you're all good for that.
Yes.
All right, so let's take this from a viewpoint from our home. Maybe you have something from your home that you can add into this question. You discuss the importance of authenticity of the doing in technology education as related to industry. Although the intent is to remain holistic and not to focus on vocational training, in order to retain this authenticity, should curriculum designers and teachers therefore try to mirror their content to dominant industries in their area? For example, right here in Newfoundland and Labrador, in Alberta, we see the energy sector, most commonly oil and gas, as a strong driving force of the economy and consequently many things in our daily lives.
So I could do that awkward thing where I could answer a question with a question. And I don't mean for you to answer it, but my answer is probably, I've written down here, I made some notes to try and prepare some thoughts. And I put to this, can my answer be simultaneously yes and no? So let me unpack that a bit. What you can't see here just now is that it sounds much like your own local community. Just 3-4 miles down the road from me is one of the largest oil refineries, probably in Europe, and there are definitely regional influences from industry and commerce on the design technology education curriculum. Same as if we go up, there's not much to the west coast. But then if you further up towards Aberdeen, further up towards the north of Scotland, very, very dominant again. And I think we find some of those same traits that you speak about in your question. So why am I saying yes and no at the same time? But I think there's different, if I unpack them, and I suppose also when I unpack them, you mentioned like curriculum designers and teachers. So these things, but I suppose when you unpack them, could be very different for a curriculum designer or teacher. And are these the same thing? Could they be the same people? Could they be different people in the system? So if I unpack the yes side, first of all, I think that there's a sort of moral and ethical duty for us as custodians of our subject area to make sure that it reflects a lot of what advances in technology in society more widely. And I think much of that you would find in industry. And I think that, we would be remiss if we didn't actually directly link with industry. I had a class of senior pupils, high school, and it was the last probably engineering type class that I taught before I moved into universities. And that year we had a sort of a science and engineering ambassador scheme that ran. And the long and short of the whole thing was you could link up with engineers out in industry. So I went the full hog, and I had like 14 pupils in my class, 14 students. And I linked every single one of them with a practicing engineer for a year. And it was absolutely fascinating. So, one of them was was looking at a control system on the phone. Engineers gave them their mobile number on the phone. The engineer happened to be at the top of a 300-foot tower. They all put their tools down, strapped on, and they had a conversation at the top of a cooling tower with this pupil in my classroom about an op amp. Do you know? So the richness, and that student I later found out went on and is a chemical engineer in the petrochemical industry. Um, there's lots to be said for it. So it's really, really valuable. And the thing that I think came out for the pupils, they couldn't believe these engineers talked about op amps. You can have a teacher standing at the front of the class telling pupils till they're blue in the face how important op amps are, how important microprocessors are, how important. It's just the teacher telling them. Do you know? I think some of them were shocked. Shocked. They were using the same formula as the pupils were. So that is worth its weight in gold, and it's 1,000 times more effective than a teacher standing in class telling pupils about it. It's important because I'm telling you it's important, right? However, I've also said simultaneously no. And the no thing, probably more correctly, is a sort of caveat to what I've just said. My strong belief is that students or pupils where I am, I think students where you are not engineers. They are not technologists. They are not cabinet makers. They are not managers of agriculture. They are pupils or their students, right? And there is something that I sort of resist against a little bit. This idea of education, the content, and then by extension, because it depends what we mean by curriculum. Sometimes people talk about curriculum and they mean everything that happens in the school. Sometimes they just mean content. Sometimes they mean other things. But you can have these scenarios where education almost sees it as its goal to simulate, to have a sort of classroom full of engineers, and they're just not. And it's not fair. And I don't think educationally we should be trying to do that. So I guess what I'm saying is there's an extreme and there's a swing. And I've heard people even refer to pupils in their class as engineers, and they are not. And the thing is, the engineers that they connect with and they speak with out there in the big wide world actually are engineers, but have had the opportunity to be pupils and to be students and to be learning. So I think as long as the educational purposes remain very, very clear and very cogently thought through, and that we are not, the pupils, we're not making the process out for them to be something they're not, then I think it can be really, really valuable. But they just need to be allowed to learn and move through that formative stage. I don't know if that's.
No, that's an awesome answer. You probably gave a couple of our viewers some great ideas, but you also uh, gave them the criteria that they should be sure to stay away from if they're going to use those ideas. Not everybody's going to be a doctor, not everybody's going to be a lawyer, not everybody's going to be an engineer, and society's made so that it doesn't have to be that way anyway. So that's a great answer. So we have time for one question from our viewers. We have Danica and Cynthia here. I think Shay has one picked out, so I'll give it a read there now for you. So Danica and Cynthia ask, how overlap, in the article you state that despite being a comparatively young subject, virtually all curricula include something that can be identified as technology education. How overlapping is technology education and the idea of doing with other subject areas? Are there some areas where there where we are more likely to see it than others. For example, math versus language arts.
Wow, I mean, that's a good question. And it's something I suppose people toil with, don't they? Um, there are different things that underlie that. So there are elements of, let's say, subject identity, though I don't like the phrase. Um, there are also more philosophical bits about what constitutes a subject. And there are practical bits as well, the whole praxis, I guess, involved in both the teaching and learning that takes place in different subjects. So, to what extent do these elements of doing cross over into other subject areas or can be seen in other subject areas? I think they can, right? Um, I always think, but so let me give you a little example then. So it could be, for example, we have, and I'm not sure the curriculum structure particularly strongly in Canada, so I offer my apologies. And in our curriculum, we have one of the technology subjects is called design and technology, and then we have another subject in the school, different curricular area, different part of the curriculum, art and design, which would be what people think of as art, involving a range of different media that, painting, sculpting, a whole range of different things. And when I was a pupil, so I'm going back even more now. I mean, I did art and design, and in my final sort of project that I did, I built a stage, a diorama, a kind of model of a stage. And actually, if you think about it, if you took a 30-second video, zoomed in on what was happening when I was doing that, you might not be able to determine whether it was an art class or a design and technology class. So there's a praxis element to it. Now, what does it practically look like, and the judgments and the wisdom involved in all of that, right? It could look, a pupil or a student in art could be doing something that looks very much, they could be doing sculpting in metal or welding, where they're actually creating metal sculptures. So there's a lot of technical processes involved in that, and there's lots of, understandings and, similar understandings involved in that. There's also, though, that philosophical part of it. And I'm going to hark back, if I can, to one of the things I think I mentioned earlier, was this idea about the nature of artifacts. And, this is where I think maybe some of the difference lies, in that I think in design and technology, subject area that we are part of, I think there should be opportunities where the artifacts and the solutions that pupils are creating, we have confidence to a decent degree are technological in nature. That's not straightforward, though, right? So there's the idea of the purposes of why these processes are being applied and why they're being used, and the purposes for doing it for an object that's artistic are quite different to the purposes for an object that's technical or technological. And that has implications for the forms of knowledge, it has implications for the types of reasoning, it has implications for the sorts of considerations you make earlier in the stages of that process of development. Because I suppose every solution and practical thing that a pupil, it's almost a solution to be, in that sort of sense. So there are different ways in which skills, processes, knowledges can reflect themselves in different areas of an education system, different areas of curriculum writ large. But I think that when you drill down a little bit further, no pun intended, then we find there can be quite distinctive differences about the forms of knowledge involved. And I think that has quite big implications for both learning from the pupil or student's point of view, and also of how we put together activities and how we conceptualize pedagogy, what becomes worthwhile, what becomes important in terms of the forms of knowledge that we think reside at the heart of what we do as teachers and what we would like our pupils to engage with and understand as students of technology.
Perfect. And thanks again, Cynthia and Danica, for that question. Another excellent one. Unfortunately, we've reached our time, so those are all the questions we can get answered today. Again, a huge thank you to you, David. All of your answers were especially helpful for me, helped me reflect on what I've learned so much already, and I'm sure that our viewers feel the same way. So again, a big thanks. Appreciate it.
And listen, just very thank you for the opportunity, and the questions that you posed made me think also. So I thank you for that.
Excellent. I can't take all the credit. Shay behind the camera, he also did quite a few. So between the two of us, thank you.
No problem. Thanks.
All right. See you later. Bye.